I recognize the member for Victoria Beacon Hill.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker, and it is my honour to rise to speak to Bill 35, Workers' Compensation Amendment Act. This is a bill, as others have mentioned, Honourable Speaker, a bill coming forward in response to the coroner's inquest into the deaths of Robert Luggie, Carole Charlie, Glenn Roche, and Alan Little. These are the 4 workers that were killed in the 2012 Prince George and Burns Lake mill explosions. And I want to use my time and take my place to speak about that tragedy, Honourable Speaker, to speak about the changes that are included in this legislation, and to speak about what's not here, based on the concerns from workers that I hear every single day regarding WorkSafe in British Columbia. But I do want to begin with the tragedy that was a push for these changes, Honourable Speaker. I have to say that I won't ever forget that call in January 2012 that came forward and that impacted so many of the lives in Burns Lake, and certainly will be imprinted on the town forever. My husband was chief of the Burns Lake Band during that time, and he called that afternoon when the explosion occurred, when he was waiting at the hospital for some of the injured workers to be brought forward. And I booked my flight that night to head up to Burns Lake the next morning, and I have to say, Honourable Speaker, it will be forever part of the memories of what went on in that town. They say that a tragedy can bring people together, and I have to say in Burns Lake you certainly saw that. It was a living example of exactly that, Honourable Speaker. It was a community in shock. It was a community with families grieving, with members who at that point no one knew for the first few days of that explosion whether people had passed away or not. There were men missing. There were individuals who had been flown out of province, had been flown obviously out of Burns Lake because of the size of Burns Lake. And there were workers in shock. And to see the extraordinary, and I think it's important to make sure that that's also part of the record, Honourable Speaker, to see the extraordinary efforts of that town to come together. The Babine First Nations opened up what is one of the biggest halls in the community, because Burns Lake, as many people know, is a very small town. And they opened up in that town the Margaret Patrick Hall, which is the large hall that's on reserve. And the town just came together in an extraordinary way. It really was a very powerful thing to witness. That hall became the place for everything over that next couple of months. It became the place where people would make food and bring it up. The hall was open almost 24 hours for the first few weeks. It became the place where counseling occurred, where counselors were brought in to provide support to family members. It became a place for people to share their emotions, to share their shock, to share the news as they heard it of each individual person, because in a small town like Burns Lake, everybody knew someone at that mill. Everyone knew the individuals who were there. Everyone knew the individuals who were hurt. Everyone is part of a large family in a very small community. Food poured in, that support poured in. There were tears and there were hugs and there were prayers and there was music every night in that hall. There was First Nations drumming. And as I said, counseling provided by professionals, but also provided by community members. Because that kind of comfort can only come from people who know the kind of experience that you're going through. And that's really what I saw in that hall. I saw an extraordinary community come together to provide that kind of support. I saw people who had worked in that mill almost their entire lives, who would choke up talking about what might happen, not knowing whether the mill was going to reopen, not knowing what their future was going to be like. And I think that description only gives a little tiny part of the life changes that really were there and still to come for those workers and their families. I experienced that aftermath of the Burns Lake fire with my family, with my husband's family, but you know, I also have spent time with the families and the families of the survivors and those who passed away at Lakeland, and I know they face the same kind of lifelong challenges, the nightmares, the anger, the fear, the loss of work for many of those individuals. And I talked to some of those individuals who had never been out of work, who'd worked their entire lives, and now all of a sudden we're faced with, what do I do every single day? I've worked at the mill. I got up, I went to the mill, I provided that kind of support for my family, and now I not only can't support my family, I have this huge gap, this sense of a loss of worth that was there. And I think that's something that is incredibly profound when you take a look at legislation. You know, it doesn't describe the kinds of challenges for those individuals. I talked to a worker last year who actually went back to work at another mill, managed to heal his burns, was able to go back to work to another mill, and he couldn't do it. And he talked about how challenging that was. He went there 3 days in a row and couldn't do it because of the flashbacks and because of the challenges and because of remembering the fireball in the mill and going through that experience. And so I rise to speak to these and put these stories on the record, Honourable Speaker, because I think it's important that we remember. It's important that we never forget that these changes are coming forward because of the fires in 2 mills, because of deaths, because of a tragedy, and because the checks and balances were not in place to prevent that loss of lives and to prevent those injuries. So I believe, Honourable Speaker, that it certainly is the right thing to bring this bill forward and to make some of the changes that have been recommended by the coroner's inquest. But I do not believe, and I've heard, and I understand why people have raised it, that Bill 35 should come forward as a comfort or a legacy for the families. And I feel, Honourable Speaker, that Bill 35 shouldn't come forward as a legacy or shouldn't come forward as a comfort. It should come forward because safety, worker safety, is just a basic right for every individual worker in this province. Things didn't happen because those rights weren't there. That safety was not there at those 2 individual mills. And so while those families certainly deserve for this legislation to come forward, I see these changes as a basic right, as a basic fundamental right for workers in this province. And I think it's important, and I know others have spoken to this as well, Honourable Speaker, to talk about why we're seeing the need for these changes. Why are these kinds of changes important? And yes, these changes came forward in the coroner's recommendations. Yes, 2 inquests occurred, not what the families were looking for. They did want a public inquiry and deserved a public inquiry. But 2 inquests did happen, and they did bring forward some important recommendations. But I believe it's much deeper than that, Honourable Speaker. I believe that these recommendations and the changes are needed because we have seen for at least 10 years in this province a government that has taken apart a system that should have been there to support workers, a system that should have been there to provide the kind of health and safety that always should be there, that should have been in place, the kinds of checks and balances to say when there was a dust warning previously that other mills should have been warned about that kind of information should have been there, that work should have been stopped when it was seen as not a safe environment, that workers shouldn't have been worried about coming forward, that they were going to lose their jobs if they raised some health and safety concerns, that they were worried about the temperature that night and whether they should be working. Previously, there have been checks and balances in place to say you don't work when the temperature goes below a certain degree. That wasn't there in this case. And those workers in our conversations and my conversations with them afterwards expressed that kind of fear, that kind of worry about a culture where they're afraid to come forward, where they're afraid to raise health and safety issues because they're worried that they're going to lose their jobs. Well, Honourable Speaker, that kind of culture doesn't happen by itself. It happens because there was a culture around WorkSafe and around worker safety in this province that said, under the BC Liberals, that we need to find a balance there that swings back to the employers. Well, Honourable Speaker, what could be more important than health and safety of workers every single day? No one in this entire legislature would say that they don't expect that workers have the right to go to work every day and come home every day, safe while they're at work, healthy when they come back home again. And yet when you look, Honourable Speaker, at the changes that were made over the last number of years, many of those changes, in fact, did swing the pendulum too far, did in fact take away checks and balances. When you're talking about people not going out on WorkSafe checks, not going out to make sure that health and safety regulations are being followed, saying to companies, it's okay, you take care of it, we trust you. Well, in fact, Honourable Speaker, it is important to have those checks and balances. We've gone through a debate in this legislature about red tape and reducing red tape. Well, Honourable Speaker, I have to tell you that when we talk about getting rid of unnecessary red tape, but recognizing that there are some regulations that are there for a reason, health and safety is one of those reasons, Honourable Speaker. It's one of those reasons you have regulations in place. It's one of the reasons you make sure that you've got the checks and balances, that it's not enough to say to someone, you can go and read this online, and you've now taken care of your health and safety issues. If you look at the issues around young workers in our province and the lack of training that many young workers get in going into dangerous work sites and dangerous workplaces without the proper health and safety time that they need, the training on the job to make sure that they're safe, those are huge concerns, Honourable Speaker. And those are concerns from my perspective that were built into the system that created that kind of culture that says, don't worry, the employer will take care of it. Well, if you look at the statistics, Honourable Speaker, it's clear that that hasn't happened. And so when I take a look at the changes needed in WorkSafe, while I'm glad to see these changes come forward in this bill, Honourable Speaker, I think it's simply one piece. I think it is a cultural shift that is needed. I think it is an important piece that is needed to say that worker safety is critical and important in this province, and that we are going to make sure that the checks and balances, that the regulations are in place, the people to follow up on those regulations are in place, and that those are taken care of. And that just seems to me, Honourable Speaker, basic rights that need to be in place in British Columbia. I talk, and I'm sure every member in this legislature hears from individuals who bring their personal stories, often injured workers who are not able to return to the workplace, who've come into their MLA's office asking about what can be done with the challenges that they're facing. And many of them are simply asking for, what I consider basic rights after you've been injured in the workplace. Rights for rehabilitation, physio, occupational physiotherapy, rights for retraining or workplace accommodation so that they can get back to work, to further training and to further education. I think some of the most heartbreaking stories, Honourable Speaker, are individuals who come to say that they have been told by their own medical doctor and specialists in many cases that they can't return to the workplace, and yet they're told by WorkSafe doctors that they have to go back tomorrow or the next day and that there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. I think those are the most shocking stories to hear from individuals who question how on earth that can happen, how they can have medical professionals, specialists, saying that it's not possible for them to return to the workplace with all of the evidence to show that, and still are getting pressure from WorkSafe saying, no, sorry, you're back to the work, and if you aren't, you get cut off all of your benefits and all of your supports and any kind of retraining that might occur. So while I certainly see these changes as a step, Honourable Speaker, I don't believe that they address the imbalance. I don't believe they address the attitude or the approach that I've seen in WorkSafe, which often seems to be that the worker is always wrong and that WorkSafe is always right. We have to change that, Honourable Speaker. WorkSafe should be there as a support. It should be there with a focus on prevention first, prevention and education. We have a wonderful organization here in Victoria called the Together Against Poverty Society, and they've partnered up with Labour over this last couple of years to do an amazing project where they are providing not only support and education, but also advocacy for workers, often young workers, who are not able to move ahead their concerns in the workplace without a fear that they're going to be fired or to be let go. They're providing an amazing service, but that service should not be necessary, Honourable Speaker. Again, I come back to the basic need of WorkSafe. WorkSafe should be there to ensure that workplaces are safe and that the prevention piece is being focused on, that we're doing everything we can to prevent accidents, that the health and safety culture is there, that if a worker believes that the workplace isn't safe, that they have every right and that they feel comfortable and have the protection to come forward and say, this isn't right. This workplace is not safe. You shouldn't be asking me to take this on because of the safety issues. Again, that doesn't happen right now. That should be something that certainly goes on. And as I mentioned, the regulations and the checks and balances that are critical to any kind of regulation. Without someone doing the checks, without someone going out there and making sure that regulations are being followed, they are simply on pieces of paper, which doesn't protect those workers and that health and safety, Honourable Speaker. You know, many of us, and I'm sure most of us in this House, have stood at the ceremony, the National Day of Mourning ceremony that occurs in April each year. And I think it's important for us to recognize those statistics as we debate Bill 35, Honourable Speaker, because as I said in the start of my remarks, these are people, these are families, these are communities that are forever impacted, forever changed by the occurrences. If we take a look at the statistics of work-related deaths, we see the numbers in 2014 were 173. 173, Honourable Speaker. Those are 173 individuals, families, communities that are forever changed. 4 young workers under the age of 24 died last year. And I have to ask, Honourable Speaker, will the changes in Bill 35 address those workers? Will the changes make a difference for those who are injured and those who are killed each year? Certainly the families in Burns Lake and Prince George, the families of Robert Lugie, of Carole Charlie, of Glenn Roche and Alan Little, certainly felt that a public inquiry would have addressed their concerns, would have better addressed their need for answers and for accountability. And so I certainly hope, as they hope, that we learn from what happened, that there's accountability for what happened, and that the changes that need to occur aren't simply changes based on this individual incident, but based on a change in the culture and the approach and the attitude in British Columbia to support workers each and every day. So I would hope in closing, Honourable Speaker, that the changes in Bill 35 are simply a start. They're simply a start and simply a reminder for all of us that worker safety is something that we need to pay attention to. Not just on the day we debate this bill, not just on the day that crisis happens, that loss of lives happen, but the worker safety needs to be something we focus on each and every single day in British Columbia. Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker.